The Diary of Dr. X, the Reality of Egalitarianism 1. There will be a sequel. As I suggested a couple of episodes ago, egalitarian political systems were typical of most tribal peoples throughout human history. This implies, by the way, that anarchism was the original political philosophy of the human species from a cross-cultural perspective. Such political systems survived in the world into very recent times, till tribal peoples were violently colonized by the expansion of the capitalist system during the colonial era. And the centralized state form of political organization was pretty much universally imposed upon them by force of arms. It was a completely foreign system to them, operating according to a political philosophy they must have considered to be completely perverse. After all, such egalitarian societies were based upon direct democracy or participatory democracy. Such a democracy involves a pattern of consensus decision-making. What this implies is that every effort is made when making a decision to ensure that it is agreeable to everyone that the decision affects, typical of small-scale societies. This may also imply that many people, or even everyone, don't get what they would most like. But it also implies that it is a decision which everyone involved is comfortable living with. Consensus decision-making usually involves long discussion in which everyone involved may freely express their opinions. Obviously, it doesn't work in a large-scale society such as our own. But social power and decision-making is widely dispersed within such egalitarian or anarchist societies, rather than centralized. Leadership decisions and positions are open to anyone because there is no permanent authority. Instead, leadership is transitory and task-oriented. For example, the best hunter will lead the hunt. The best warrior will lead the attack or the raid, etc. But when the task at hand is accomplished, what authority they had during that task is quite simply no longer operational. It just evaporates. Leadership in such situations is based upon the respect of other individuals in one's societies for one's skills, abilities, and intelligence. But there is no permanent authority. In other words, egalitarian societies do have leaders, namely the people that others habitually go to for advice. But they do not have rulers, as states do by definition. People who can order everybody else around with impunity. This is because no social institutions exist which could force people to follow the orders of a leader in such societies, egalitarian or anarchist societies. Participation in any action, a hunt, a war party, the movement of the camp, is instead entirely voluntary. Very importantly, egalitarian cultures also apply this pattern of democratic decision-making to both political and economic decisions. This is very much unlike our own supposed democracy. Direct democracy of this kind is also associated with a pattern of substantive rather than formal equality. What this means is that people were relatively equal in fact in terms of their access to wealth and social power. Substantive equality was assured by the common practice of what we call in the anthropological literature generalized reciprocity among tribal peoples. Generalized reciprocity refers to the practice of freely sharing food and other goods among the group. without consideration for anyone else's ability to repay one's kindness and generosity, very much as we do still within our nuclear families. What this implies is that egalitarian societies recognize what has been called an irreducible minimum in the literature to which all members of the group were entitled. Those who had the ability to acquire more goods through hunting or gathering or horticulture or crafts were expected to share with those who were less fortunate. One's generosity was also an important characteristic of a leader in such a society, because a leader had to be someone who people could look up to as an example of the society's most important values, with generosity being the keystone in this case. The leaders tended to be the successful people with a regular surplus to share. And yes, they gained status from this in the eyes of the other members of society. But you will note that their high status, if such it may even be called, was gained as a result of giving away surplus wealth, not from hoarding it, or by finding ways of using it to exploit others who were less fortunate, as in our society. State-level societies are the precise opposite. State-level societies are characterized by centralized rule, which is bureaucratically organized. Orders flow from a supreme authority of some kind through a hierarchy of lower offices and officers. In our society, the bankers are on top. The central political instrument of any state, including our own, is violence, or the threat of violence. While we don't think about them in those terms in our everyday lives, because we have all basically been domesticated through centuries of state rule, sociological theorists pointed out a long time ago that our armies, courts, jails, and police all use the threat of violence to maintain social order. Either you do what you are told, or the state will expropriate your money or property, fine you, incarcerate you, torture you in some cases, or even execute you at their discretion. States also claim a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within our state-level societies. That is the difference between murder and heroism in war, for example. Murder is punishable because it is something an individual undertakes without state permission. Killing in war is exactly the same act, of course, objectively, but is rewarded and praised because it is done under orders from the state. The legitimate use of force also explains the difference between what happened on 9/11 and the response to it. The former is an act of terrorism because it is an act that was undertaken by individuals acting without the backing of orders from any particular state. The attacks on Afghanistan and later Iraq, on the other hand, were legitimate acts of war because they were ordered and undertaken by state authorities through proper channels. Most states throughout human history were totalitarian and sanctioned both torture and execution of those they classified as criminals. The marriage between what we spin as democracy and the state is a relatively recent experiment in human history. Nor are contemporary democracies based on participatory democracy such as egalitarian societies are. Rather, what we have is a form of representative democracy, which was, I guess, the best our forefathers could come up with after being inspired by the example of Native American polities. What we do is to periodically elect a group of people who will supposedly represent the views and interests of their constituents in a centralized government structure. We then get a chance to vote them out and replace them on a periodic basis, even though they're all beholden to the bankers ultimately. Representative democracies are better than totalitarian states, don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan of democracy, actually, in all its forms, but representative democracies are still based on competition rather than consensus, just like our economic system. Competition between individuals, between ideologies, and between parties. The basic principle of a legitimate representative democracy is that the majority rules. This is again consistent with the competitive and factional pattern, which posits that if the two factions were to fight it out, rather than vote, the party with the most members would be most likely to win. So why not just concede victory to them and avoid the bloodshed, right? It also leaves room for the possibility of what Thomas Jefferson called the tyranny of the majority. What this implies is the imposition of their will by a majority upon even a very large minority of the population, and with the usual instruments of violence which all states possess to back it up. As a smoker, I'd have to say that smoking laws are a prominent example. Very importantly, we also apply democratic principles only to the political process in the Western world. Economic decision-making remains completely authoritarian. CCCP, in other words. It is based upon the axiom that you either do what you are told or you are fired, and employees have no input into either managerial decisions nor who the owners or managers they work for will be. Completely undemocratic. In representative democracies, the equality of which we speak is also quite different from that in participatory democracies. Representative democracies are characterized by formal equality rather than substantive equality. Formal equality refers to the way in which we consider everyone to be equal before the law. Isn't that sweet? This does not mean that you are equal in fact. The focus here is on guaranteeing equal treatment of all individuals by the state, despite the fact that individuals in our society, in fact, are grossly unequal in terms of their wealth and social power. Some people have billions of dollars and some people are homeless, like my friends out in the street in Osborne Village. For example, a rich businessman and a beggar may both receive the same fine for the same crime. Yet this amount may represent pocket change to the one and more money than they have seen in weeks or months to the other. And while a stint in jail awaits the beggar who cannot pay, the rich man can afford to flout minor laws, such as parking tickets, with impunity. They are considered to be equals and are treated by state institutions as equals in Western society, even though they are not equal in fact, much to the detriment of the poor. Some are born to riches and privilege and others to dire poverty, and yet in such a society there is even talk, which makes me laugh, of equal opportunity to all. What a fucking joke. What this implies is that the system is designed in such a way that the state is required by law to ignore actual inequalities in our society. That's part of its philosophical mandate, in fact. Consequently, the overall pattern is predominantly hierarchical. And despite our inequalities, we are still considered to be equally free. Free to compete for unequal positions of wealth and social power within a hierarchical society, that is. And well, if you don't make the grade, well then too damn bad for you.